Donald Trump is putting together his new administration, and the big question on everyone's minds is how he will handle China, which has become America's biggest geopolitical competitor. We've seen some big news in recent days. Congressman Mike Waltz is the new national security advisor. Senator Marco Rubio could be the new Secretary of State. Both men are prominent China hawks, and it's leading to major questions about how Trump will handle China. It's an important relationship, the US-China relationship, for the future of global stability. Joining us now is Susan Thornton, a top American diplomat with over 3 decades of experience handling China, North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. She's one of America's most experienced commentators on its policy in Asia. She was one of the top officials in the early years of the Trump administration and handled its policy on China as well as North Korea. She is currently senior fellow at the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale University. Susan Thornton, thank you so much for joining us. Could I ask you a very simple question just to begin with? How do you see the new Trump administration's policy evolving on China? We've seen, as I said before, some big news. Congressman Mike Waltz could be the new national security advisor. Senator Marco Rubio could be the new Secretary of State. Both of these men are prominent China hawks. Do you believe we're likely to see more continuity than change from Trump's first term in office?
Yeah, well, of course, we know that President-elect Trump is famously unpredictable. He's said certainly a lot of things about China on the campaign trail. And as you note, many of the appointees that we're hearing about so far are quite well known to be very opposed to China and have said a lot of negative things about China. So I think it's, fair to assess that there will be a much stronger line against China than that was coming on the heels of the Biden administration. Is there going to be more continuity than change from Trump 1.0? I think there will be continuity from the first Trump administration and even more tariffs, more sanctions, more anti-China rhetoric, and probably a lot more drama, more scrutiny of Chinese coming to the U.S. and Chinese in the U.S. And I think that is the initial trend, at least we'll see. Now, whether you can call that a policy or whether it's more of an attitude, we'll have to see exactly what the kind of policy proposals are coming, but certainly the atmosphere is going to be quite negative, I think, on China.
Could I also ask you, how is Beijing likely to look at Donald Trump's return to the White House? Will there be fears given his policies on trade? Will they fear the return of a trade war? Or will China view his return as a good thing because of his reputation as a deal maker, someone who could evolve a broader understanding between the United States and China on key political questions?
Well, there has been quite a bit of coverage about, at least from the official side in Beijing, that they will be prepared for the election of either candidate, and that I know some people have been calling it, they would be drinking from one of two bowls of poison. So, in other words, both possibilities were seen as negative in Beijing. I think China's been doing its kind of contingency planning the way a lot of other countries have been doing in the wake of this election. And I think they feel that they know Donald Trump from the first Trump administration, although China tends to dislike the kind of unpredictability and sort of chaotic style that comes with Donald Trump. I think they feel like they do know him. They think there will be an escalation in trade friction for sure. And I think they are planning for this and planning their own counter moves. Of course, the timing is bad for the Chinese economy because they're still trying to recover from COVID and going through a lot of different policy experimentation to try to stimulate and get back to a path of growth that will get them to where they want to be this year. So I think they're quite worried about the economic measures that are going to come from the Trump administration and thinking about how they can try to counter those amid a very tough situation that they're facing already economically. And I think that is kind of their big priority. They may think that there could be a deal with Trump. Of course, we had the phase one trade deal last time, and They may think they could reach that point again, but just to remind, the phase one trade deal came in January of 2020 after, 3 tough years of dealing with tariffs and other measures that were coming from the United States. So, usually the pattern would be that the Trump administration would want to build up some leverage to use in a negotiation, and then the negotiation would probably be quite drawn out. So a deal, if it was coming, would probably not be very immediate.
Ms. Thornton, you've allowed me to segue into an interesting question, which is about trade wars and the first trade war that Donald Trump launched with China during the early years of his administration. The opinion is really divided about whether America really benefited from Trump's first trade spat with China. He slapped tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, which then invited retaliatory sanctions from the Chinese. And there was a deal worked out where the Chinese agreed to buy certain quantums of US goods and US products, which then in the end did not end up happening. So the question I really have for you is, did Trump's first attempt to force China to abide by what the United States wanted, did that first trade war really work out the way he hoped it would?
Well, there has been a lot of discussion about that, certainly during the campaign, and the general opinion of many people, including most economists, is that the sort of tariffs that were levied by the Trump administration on China probably didn't actually achieve very much. Now, Trump maintains that they did, so this is a point of contention, but that, most of those tariffs were paid by the American purchasers of those products, and that in many cases the tariffs were avoided by trade diversion. In other words, things were shipped around through third countries so that they were not tariffed. Did the trade deal bring benefits? I think, it might have brought benefits, but because COVID hit at exactly the same time that trade deal was inked, basically was never implemented, or wasn't certainly not lived up to on the Chinese side, as the sort of global economy went off a cliff and then people tried to grapple with the pandemic. So, whether we would want to rerun this experiment or not, I think most people who look at these issues would probably say the cost benefit analysis for the American people was not there. As you mentioned, the Chinese retaliated with their own tariffs on big sectors of American exports to China, like agriculture. So the U.S. had to then compensate farmers in billions of dollars worth of lost exports because of that. So there were a lot of dislocations as a result of those moves, and I think many people would say they probably didn't really pan out. But there were a lot of extenuating circumstances too, and certainly Trump's not convinced that it didn't work. He's certainly seems determined to try it again.
Right. If I could ask you, Ms. Thornton, to now address some broader strategic questions that have been floating around over the last couple of weeks since Trump got re-elected. There's this question about Trump's commitment to the defense of the island of Taiwan. It has faced increasing military pressure from China over the last couple of years, but it's really unclear how Donald Trump would deal with this particular question. Could you explain how Trump's policy would differ from that of the Biden administration? Is it likely to be very different? And how would that be received by China as well as other powers in the region?
Yeah, I would say that it's fair to characterize Trump's attitude toward Taiwan and the question of the defense of Taiwan as unclear. I don't think he's ever been very clear on it, but I do think that his policy, at least going into his second administration here, would be largely the same as the Biden administration policy. We know that Trump likes to certainly make large weapons sales to foreign countries, and it seems like that's an avenue with the Taiwans that would continue to take place. Taiwan does buy a lot of weapons from the U.S., and there's already moves afoot apparently on the Taiwan side to put forward a new request for major weapons sales from the U.S. So that's one thing that's probably going to continue. He hasn't been clear about sort of the defense of Taiwan, but I think the U.S. has had a policy of quote unquote strategic ambiguity on that score under the Biden administration as well. And I think in the case, let's say that the Chinese tried to do in Taiwan what something like what Putin did in Ukraine, I think either the Biden administration or the Trump administration would come to the support of Taiwan. Now, whether that means they would send U.S. troops, I don't think we can tell that outside of a specific description of a contingency. But I think support for Taiwan would be there in that scenario. I think the one outstanding question for a potential Trump administration is, he tends to see Taiwan as part of a whole picture involving China. And he fancies himself certainly as a deal maker. So whether he sees Taiwan, knowing how important it is to China, as a part of some kind of a bigger deal with China, is something that is possibly in his mind, but it didn't come up in the first Trump administration, which was kind of taken over by the COVID pandemic. So we don't know if that is something that would come up in his administration this time or not. I do think that last time during the transition before he took office, he did take a phone call from Tsai Ing-wen, the president of Taiwan. That probably isn't going to happen again this time, because I think he has gotten an appreciation for the sensitivities and how much the Chinese care about this issue. Probably something like that won't happen again.
Right. Ms. Thornton, would you allow me to, I think, return to a question that I had perhaps put to you a little earlier, which was that Donald Trump seems to see himself as a deal maker, someone who can get things done in the interest of the United States and break through sort of these intractable conflicts. That's how he likes to see himself, and it seems like it opens up an opportunity for a broader US-China understanding that can reduce tensions between the two countries. Are we likely to see something like this, some sort of broader deal between, some grand bargain between the United States and China?
I think it's possible, but it's probably not likely in the beginning of his administration. And he's a deal maker, but he does like to be the star of his own reality TV show, which requires a little bit of drama. And he tends to like to raise the tensions and the level of drama first, and then, kind of get to the deal later on. And so I think that's a pattern that we've seen in a lot of different instances. And I think in the case of U.S.-China relations, given the rhetoric that we've seen around China policy and, the Trump first administration attitudes toward China and where they ended up after the COVID-19 pandemic, I just think it's going to take us a while to get there if there is such a deal in the back of his mind. I do think he'll try to address some other issues in international relations off the bat. Something like, the Ukraine crisis. Obviously, he's already said he wants to kind of become a peacemaker in that context. I think the Middle East is something that he's cared about a lot in the past. He spent a lot of time on the Middle East in his first administration, and I think he'll be looking to make some inroads there. So the China deal would probably have to come, much later, if at all.
Something that's got a lot of attention is that some of Trump's key advisors have called for a refocus on Asia. Their view is that America has been simply too focused on the conflict in the Middle East right now, as well as the conflict in Ukraine. And the idea is that, look, China is our major strategic competitor. We have to move the focus back to China and back to Asia. Now, lots of presidents in the past have talked about this pivot to Asia. It's not always worked out. But there is some hope that under Trump, we will see more of an Asian focus in US foreign policy. How do you view those hopes and aspirations?
Well, I could tell you that it certainly wouldn't be an instant switch. We've got a lot of obligations in a lot of parts of the world, and they're not going to be dispensed with so quickly. I mean, remember, Trump was trying to get out of Afghanistan for quite a long time and wanted to do the withdrawal from Afghanistan at the end of his administration, and was persuaded not to do that. So these things never work out in as immediate a time frame as people hope that they will. I mean, I do think there is this continual impulse in U.S. kind of policymaking circles to move the preponderance of our military focus away from Europe and toward Asia. I think that's been there for more than 20 years. As you rightly point out, it's been very difficult to do because the crises have erupted in other parts of the world and not in Asia. And as you can well appreciate, it's the crises that drive the focus of the sort of uh, international and policy-making elites in Washington, and they have to respond to things. So I think if there can be a crisis in Europe that is solved, like the Ukraine crisis can be solved, and Trump can manage to put that into the European basket in terms of who has responsibility for overseeing that, then there would be some space to, refocus a little bit on Asia. And certainly there are some Trump advisors that are pushing that. In particular, Bridge Colby has been making this point.
Ms. Thornton, you were a top US diplomat. You worked with handling a lot of American allies in Asia, like Japan, South Korea. They have in the past clashed with the Trump administration, particularly on issues of defense contributions. Are they paying enough for the maintenance of US forces in their respective countries? How are they likely to receive a second Trump term?
Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting to see the lineup of leaders calling Trump and congratulating him on his election. Of course, the Indian Prime Minister Modi was one of the early ones, but also Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba and then Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol were also among the very early phone calls that Trump took. I think, of course, Japan and Korea did, as you said, have a little bit of a hard time with the first Trump administration. There was a kind of this feeling that the Asian allies weren't doing enough for their own security, and there were renegotiations of basing agreements, etc. But Korea and Japan both have since really stepped up in many respects. They have increased their contributions to host nation support. They have, increased their defense budgets and percentage of funding that they spend on military preparedness, etc. Japan has really changed kind of its the constitution and other aspects of its ability to ramp up its military readiness and contribute to contingencies in the Asia Pacific region. And so I think Japan and Korea have both done quite a bit. We renegotiated the Korea Free Trade Agreement under the first Trump administration. The new basing agreement has already been renegotiated under the Biden administration. I think they're quite nervous about trade. I think everyone in the world is actually quite nervous about trade and the global trading system and what kind of tariffs they're going to see coming out of the U.S. and how that's going to affect the global economy. And certainly Japan and Korea, both export dependent economies, are going to be concerned about that. But I think they're going to, think that they can again work with the Trump administration and hope that they can press their views concertedly and convincingly with him.
And if I could also ask you, you talked about India. There are other regional powers, of course, here that are looking keenly at U.S.-China tensions and so on and so forth. How would you advise them? How would you advise, for example, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi to look at U.S.-China tensions that are playing out right now and how they will evolve over the next couple of years?
Well, I think the most worrisome thing in U.S.-China relations, from my standpoint, is the handling of the Taiwan contingency, because that's the one place that could really erupt into a full-scale, major power war in the Asia Pacific region, which would be devastating for not just the Asia Pacific, not just China and Taiwan, but for the entire world and certainly the global economy. So we'd like to certainly avoid that. I think Trump's made it pretty clear he wants to avoid that, but whether he knows how to avoid that is something that I have been concerned about. And it seems that his advisors and some of his appointees have very strongly held views on this that may not be the same ones that Trump has. So I think that's a space to certainly watch and pay attention to. The economy is going to be a huge issue. How much decoupling between the U.S. and China happens will have knock-on effects for every country in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. And so I think we will see quite significant further decoupling between the US and Chinese economies. And businesses are going to have to adjust to that. Economies are going to have to adjust to that. There's some talk of withdrawing most favored nation status from China completely, and a lot of other talk about export controls being ramped up and more sanctions, et cetera. So I think this is going to create a lot of distortions and adjustments that need to be made in the economic space. I hope that won't lead to any kind of a conflict, but it is something that I think India certainly is going to have to pay attention to.
Ms. Thornton, sitting here in Delhi, one of the things that gets a lot of attention is China's growth in military power, especially the growth in power of its navy. We've seen, Chinese naval forces expand their presence in areas that India considers extremely important to its foreign policy, including the Indian Ocean. Now, there's this sense that Trump fighting with his allies like Japan and South Korea, and his general philosophy of doing less in the world is creating some concern here, because the concern is that his reluctance to do more with allies and his tendency to fight with them will embolden countries like China to act more aggressively in Asia, and that will be a negative thing for a number of countries here, Japan, South Korea, as well as India. Do you have a view of that particularly?
Well, I think you raised a lot of issues there, and it's a very good question and a complex question. Part of the complexity comes from what are apparently different views, maybe different views among Trump and some of his advisors and others of his advisors. I mean, we know that some of his advisors certainly think there should be a focus on the Indo-Pacific, and that there should be a major American military presence and continual kind of backstopping of security in Asia Pacific. Others, maybe Mike Waltz, maybe others that I've heard of, think that the U.S. should sort of withdraw its frontline presence from different places in the world, not probably just Asia. It's really hard to say where this is going to come out. I do think that there is a huge focus in the Trump administration on the military industrial complex. I mean, there has been under the Biden administration as well, and I think that that will continue. So on things like, production of armaments, production of ships, et cetera, beefing up the U.S. military will be something that the Trump administration will pay attention to. So how that jibes with withdrawing presence from overseas, I'm not exactly sure. But as we mentioned, people like Bridge Colby think we should focus more attention and resources on the Asia Pacific. So we really don't know. I do think that there will, over the long term, and Trump represents this impulse in the American electorate. I wrote an article about this for the East Asia Forum. I do think that there is an impulse to try to downsize America's security burden around the world, including in the Asia Pacific, and that there is a focus, and has been even under the Biden administration and previously, of getting Asian allies to work more together and to step up their own security partnerships, but also their own domestic contributions to their own security. So I think that is something that we see now. Whether we think that that displaces the actual U.S. presence and commitment, I'm not sure yet. And I think we'll have to see how that pans out.
Thank you so much, Susan Thornton, there laying out for us the Trump administration's policy on China in the past, what it is likely to look like in the future, how other Asian countries should see US-China tensions in the years to come. Susan Thornton, one of the most experienced voices from America on Asia and the politics in the Indo-Pacific, as well as on China. Thank you so much, Ms. Thornton, for joining us. And thank you so much, viewers, for joining us on India Today Global.